In the Gospel of Mark, following Jesus' teaching on the four soils, he punctuates the parable with the line, "Whoever has ears, let them hear." In Matthew 11, he uses the same phrase in talking about the identity of John the Baptist. In Luke 14, while in the house of a prominent Pharisee, Jesus concludes a series of parables and teaching with the same phrase. And then in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, Jesus uses it 7 times, once for each of the 7 churches, admonishing them to hear and heed his words. Now, all that to say, when we get to Revelation 13, verse 9, and we come across the phrase, "Whoever has ears, let them hear," well, we're not exactly told that Jesus is speaking. For an informed reader, the conclusion should be obvious enough. These are the words of our risen Lord. It's kind of an odd placement, though, isn't it? I mean, we've just read about the beast from the sea who's been blaspheming the name of the Lord and waging war on God's people. We'll surely turn our attention to the second beast, the one that arises from out of the earth, who's got horns like a lamb but speaks like a dragon, who can perform great signs, even causing fire to rain down from heaven. In the meantime, sandwiched between thing 1 and thing 2, we encounter these words of our Lord. We've kind of skipped over it in Revelation, but if we could just talk a moment about the phrase, "Whoever has ears, let them hear." I'd like to unpack its meaning. Most of us have ears, and most of us can hear. Google what happens when you hear, and it'll tell you something about our eardrums picking up and vibrating as a result of sound waves. It's sent further into our inner ear, where these little hair-like cells convert it into electric signals, which send that into our brain, which hopefully translates it into some kind of message. Some of you may point out I missed a step or two, but for the most part, that's hearing. But it's obvious enough that's not what Jesus is talking about. To have ears to hear means more than merely registering sound. Ears to hear is about spiritual understanding. In the gospel context, there were those who heard and understood. Granted, it was often with some help from Jesus, but they understood it. And then there are those who just didn't get it. They had ears, but they couldn't hear. So I think that only gets us part of the way. Spiritual understanding is important, but by itself is insufficient. What's required in hearing is not only a spiritual understanding, but a spiritual openness along with a spiritual obedience. In Matthew 7, at the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus contrasts 2 kinds of people who hear his message. It says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." And he follows it up with, "But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand." The problem with many of us is not that we don't hear or that we don't understand. We understand more than enough. The problem with our hearing is that it doesn't yield itself in doing. May God grant us that kind of hearing in our lives, the kind of hearing that leads to a life pleasing to him. Have a blessed week.